The town of Willow Creek had long been known for its folklore, a tapestry of ghost stories and whispered legends that bound its residents together in fear. At the heart of them all was a tale that no one dared to speak aloud, for fear that it might come to life. The Watcher, a name that brought chills, even in daylight. A figure who, it was said, could be summoned if you knew the ritual, if you had the courage or the foolhardiness to go through with it. Rumor had it that the Watcher had first come to Willow Creek over a century ago. Some said he was a man. Others whispered that he had never been human at all, that he was some twisted spirit, a creature that fed on fear, on souls. To summon him, they said, was to invite death itself, to play with fire and beg to be burned. The ritual was precise, meant only for those who truly wanted to see him. You needed to stand alone, in front of a mirror at the stroke of midnight, with a single candle. You'd stare into your reflection and chant the incantation. Watcher, come. Watcher, stay. Watcher, take this soul away. It sounded simple enough, but those who tried were never seen again. All that was left of them was the whisper of their screams, echoing in the abandoned rooms they'd haunted in their last moments. It was Halloween night, a night when the borders between the living and the dead grew thin, when ghosts slipped through the veil like shadows. Sophie, David, and Aaron, three restless teenagers looking for thrills, heard about the legend in school. They were drawn to it, laughing at the absurdity of it, dismissing it as some spooky story. They told each other that it was all just a prank, but secretly, each one felt a twinge of dread, a warning from deep within that this was no ordinary ghost story. But they pushed it aside, eager for a scare. They decided on the old manor at the end of town, a place that seemed haunted, even without a story attached to it. The house stood on a slight hill, surrounded by dead trees that clawed at the night sky, casting long skeletal shadows over the yard. Its windows were dark and cracked, its walls sagging from years of neglect. It looked as though it had been abandoned for decades, a place time had forgotten, where memories twisted into nightmares and darkness took on a life of its own. The three friends squeezed through a broken window, their flashlights casting eerie thin beams that barely penetrated the thick darkness. The air inside was stale, laced with the faint scent of rot and mildew, a stifling closeness that made it feel like the house was breathing, inhaling each of their movements. They climbed the winding staircase to the attic, following the creaks and groans of the ancient wood underfoot, each step amplifying the silence that filled the empty rooms below. In the attic, they found a mirror, tall and grimy, covered in years of dust, its frame tangled with cobwebs that glistened in the dim light. The mirror's surface was dark, almost black, but as they brushed away the dust, their own reflections flickered back at them, distorted by the warped glass. The candle Sophie held cast a thin, weak light, barely illuminating their faces. But it was enough. With a deep breath, Sophie placed the candle on the floor, the flame casting strange shadows that danced around the attic, warping the shadows in unsettling shapes. Her hand trembled as she began the incantation, her voice a shaky whisper as she repeated the words that had haunted her since she first heard them. Watcher, come. Watcher, stay. Watcher, take this soul away. For a moment, nothing happened. They exchanged glances, each one secretly relieved, half laughing at the foolishness of it all. But then, the candle flame sputtered, and a chill filled the room, thick and unnatural, as if a window had opened into a dark, frozen world beyond their own. The flame flickered, and in the mirror, the shadows deepened, coalescing into something far darker than they'd imagined. A shape began to form, tall and gaunt, like a figure pulled from a nightmare. It moved slowly, as if peeling itself away from the shadows that clung to it like smoke. Its body stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic, as if the very rules of reality bent around it. They saw its eyes first. Dark, endless voids that seemed to pull at their souls, trapping them in a silent scream. The figure stepped forward, inching closer with each breath they took. Its eyes never blinked, its mouth a thin, pale line that seemed to stretch too wide, too unnatural, like a grotesque grin meant to mock their fear. They couldn't look away, couldn't move, paralyzed by the icy tendrils of terror that wrapped around their hearts, squeezing tighter with each passing second. In a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, Sophie tried to speak, to break the spell, but the sound caught in her throat, muffled by the thick silence that had taken over the room. She reached out, her fingers trembling, but as she did, the Watcher's hand lifted, mirroring her movement. His fingers impossibly long, bony, each one tipped with a sharp, jagged nail that gleamed in the candlelight. David reached for her, grabbing her arm, yanking her back, just as the Watcher's hand brushed against the glass, his fingers pressing against it with a sickening, wet sound. The mirror seemed to ripple, the glass turning dark, as if something vile was seeping through, oozing from the edges, as the Watcher's twisted face pressed against the surface, his grin widening, stretching until it seemed to split his face in two. They ran, stumbling down the stairs, their footsteps pounding against the old wood, the sound echoing through the house like the toll of a death bell. But as they reached the front door, they froze. The door wouldn't open. No matter how hard they pulled, no matter how they struggled, it was as if the house itself had sealed them in, trapping them within its walls, binding them to the Watcher's game. They backed away, panic filling their eyes as they looked around, only to see shadows creeping closer, stretching from the dark corners of the room, from the walls, from the floor. Every inch of the house was alive with it, pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to whisper their names, calling them, taunting them. Erin stumbled, her back hitting a wall as she heard footsteps echoing down the hall. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. She looked around, her heart pounding, only to see a figure in the distance. The Watcher, slowly emerging from the shadows, his eyes fixed on her, his grin wider than ever. David grabbed her hand, pulling her into another room, but they found themselves surrounded by mirrors, each one reflecting the Watcher, each one showing his twisted, elongated form reaching for them. His fingers clawed at the glass, leaving trails of dark, thick liquid that oozed down the mirrors, pooling on the floor, staining their feet. Sophie turned her back to the wall, her eyes darting from mirror to mirror, each one filled with horror as she saw herself, her own reflection fading, becoming pale, hollow. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and she felt her body grow cold, numb, as if her soul were slipping away, drawn into the glass, trapped with him. David tried to pull her free, but his fingers passed through hers. She was slipping, her face twisting in terror, her voice lost in the void. He screamed, his voice echoing through the empty halls, but no one heard him. No one came. In the end, only David was left, standing in a room that seemed to stretch on forever, filled with mirrors, each one reflecting the faces of his friends. Their eyes empty, their mouths open in eternal screams, trapped in the Watcher's grasp. He stumbled backward, his mind unraveling, the whispers clawing at his sanity, filling his head with screams that would never fade. He felt a hand on his shoulder, cold and sharp, and as he turned, the Watcher's face was inches from his eyes black and endless, his mouth opening to devour him. David's scream filled the room, echoing off the walls, swallowed by the silence. And then, there was nothing. In the morning, the mansion stood empty, silent as always. The mirror in the attic now holding 3 new reflections, each one a face frozen in terror, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes forever haunted. The watcher was gone, waiting for the next poor soul to summon him, to feed his hunger. But those who dared call him, they would remain, trapped, eternally watching, eternally waiting.